Hi, folks. Let's talk about God. The other day, after the school shooting in Parkland in Florida, Wayne LaPierre, head of the NRA, said, "The right to own a gun is not bestowed by man, but is granted to all Americans by God as their birthright." It's an interesting concept of God. I think it's very easy to reject the idea of God out of hand when you hear things like that. You go, well, this is obviously tribalism being justified under the idea that God exists. I find this fascinating because I've had a couple of these conversations with gun advocates on Twitter that are interesting. I don't want to get the political here. They're interesting in that they represent an idea of God, which is very weird to me. But what is God anyway? Joshi Sasaki, in his book Buddha is the Center of Gravity, says this. Now, I know Joshi Sasaki's reputation is totally in the trash bin, but I still think this book is really good. If we look back at the history of every race or nation, we can see that each one has a god who protects and benefits its own interests. That god worked for his race and protected it against its enemies. That is why the people venerate him. Some of the gods encouraged wars for the benefit of their own race. Racial religions are like that. If you worship that kind of god, we cannot stop wars. Even if you believe in that kind of god, death still exists. Evil still exists. The God who is standing in front of you as an object says, "I am your God," but he is not. Your small mind recognizes that God as an object. Even if that God has great power, it is not the real God. And yet I wrote a whole book about God and God's position in Buddhism. Now, a lot of people say that Buddhism is a religion without God. D.T. Suzuki very famously leads off one of his most important books about Zen Buddhism with the statement that Zen Buddhism recognizes no God and nothing to worship and no abode to which the dead are destined. I think is the quote, something like that. And in one sense, that's true. The God of Wayne LaPierre, head of the NRA, is not part of the Zen tradition or the Buddhist tradition at all. The tribal god of religions around the world that Joshi Sasaki talks about, that is also not part of the Zen tradition. And yet, it's not correct to label Buddhism and Zen Buddhism in particular as a form of atheism, because it's not atheism either. There's a place for something that people have called God in Buddhism and Zen Buddhism too. In Shobo Genzo, in this case book 2 of the Nishijima Cross version, Dogen uses an interesting word, inmo, which is just a Chinese word that means it or that or what. Often when people are translating Dogen, they'll try to use funny words like suchness or thusness or something like that as a translation for inmo, but those are incorrect translations. They're trying to put too much of a spin on the thing. It's just a word that means it or what. And here's how Dogen talks about it in the Nishijima Cross translation. The situation of this supreme truth of Bodhi, that's the Buddha's realized truth, is such that even the whole universe in 10 directions, and 10 directions just means all directions, is just a small part of the supreme truth of Bodhi. It may be that the truth of Bodhi abounds beyond the universe. We ourselves are tools which it possesses within the universe in the 10 directions. How do we know that it exists? The it, again, is this word inmo. We know it is so because our body and mind both appear in the universe, yet neither is our self. There's an interesting idea right there. The body and mind appear in the universe, and yet neither is our self. So my body is not myself. Now that's an idea that we find a lot of religions agree with. The Hindus, in particular, had this idea that the body is not to be identified as the self, that the self is something that dwells within the body and then leaves the body at the time of death. Buddhists rejected that. The Buddha very strongly rejected that idea. Now, the interesting thing that Dogen says here, again, is the mind is also not the self. Now, we often imagine that the mind is our self. But the more you look at your own mind, the more you see that this identification of self and mind is false. You have to be very quiet for a very long time to start to see this. But once you start to see this, it becomes undeniable, and you just can't turn away from it very easily anymore. You go, wow, even my own mind is not myself. Even this thing called self that I have built up for so many years, protecting and defending, isn't me. So what is it? In Buddhist terms, this mind, this thing that we take for granted as being ours, belonging to us, is actually the possession of something much bigger. And that much bigger something is what Dogen calls it, or the supreme truth of Bodhi. And it's the same thing, I think, as what some of the Christian mystics and Islamic mystics and even the Hindu mystics have identified as God. When they are talking about God, they're not talking about this kind of tribal God or this kind of Wayne LaPierre God that grants rights to Americans but doesn't grant them to other people or something like that. This is something much bigger. Now, I totally reject the Wayne LaPierre God or the tribal God. It doesn't make sense. There cannot be such an entity. And even if there was such an entity, I wouldn't want to get anywhere near it because it sounds pretty awful. I don't want to be near the Wayne LaPierre God, or probably not even the Billy Graham God. God is something much different from that. But it means that we don't have this kind of thing to appeal to, or do we? Getting back to the Joshu Sasaki book, he says something kind of interesting here. Lost people say this and that about God. If you thank God for his help in producing or getting something, that is just egotism. But Zen doesn't say that it is wrong to thank God. It is right to thank God, but only if you have experienced God from his standpoint. Otherwise, you are only increasing your desires. And a couple of pages on, he clarifies that a bit. If you want to see God or Buddha, you must manifest yourself as emptiness. At the moment you manifest your imperfect consciousness as nothingness, your imperfect consciousness becomes perfect and illuminated. You are educated all your life to venerate God and reject evil. Zen education is totally different. It teaches you how to swallow God and the devil at once. So we have a very different idea of God, but God isn't absent. God is completely impossible to define, and yet we have a sense that we are connected with something. And I don't want to attribute anything to that something. I can't even say it's good, nor can I say it's evil. It's something that surrounds and penetrates us all and is us all. It's not quite the Force in the sense of Star Wars, but it's edging a little close in there, but it's not quite that either, because the Force is also devolves in the movies into a kind of tribal god where the Force works for the good guys and doesn't work for the bad guys because they're not in with the Force enough or something. I never quite got that one. But there is this idea of God. Sometimes people say it's pantheism, but I don't know if pantheism is the right word. There's an idea, though, that whatever it is, this it in Dogen's sense, is present in everything. So it's present in you and me, and it's present in the computer that you're watching this on, and in your cat, and in the rocks and the street outside, and the planet, and the stars, and the air, the atmosphere. It's all infused with this something. This is the way Zen tends to look at God. So you can't pin God down in any way. We may be kind of an experiment that God is doing to try to see if he is just the common gendered pronoun for God. I'm sorry I have to use it, but let's use it anyway. That he is doing to see if he can move on a little further in his own evolution through the existence of entities who can recognize him. That's my view of God. That's my little Zen view of God. If you enjoyed this, thanks a lot. I make my living through donations, and the places to send those donations to are linked below. I appreciate all your help. See you next time.